Yo, it's your boy Logos, and today I want to react to Thomas Sowell discuss facts about Germans that were never taught in school. In my opinion, the Nazi regime and Adolf Hitler really overshadows a lot of rich German slash Prussian history, and I think that's very sad because the culture, music, and military tradition goes far beyond Nazi Germany and the atrocities and stains that was left on this world by Adolf Hitler and his supporters. But unfortunately, thanks to the media, Hollywood, and just basic, I don't know, attention to detail or attention span by people in general, people really don't care for the older history. They just want to go with the more modern stuff where you have a crazy egomaniac of a leader telling people doing crazy things and they're all hooked on drugs or some type of ideology. I can understand how it hooks people and ropes people in, but at the same time, Germany and Prussia goes way beyond that. A lot of the stuff that we tied to Nazi Germany, especially military wise, existed before. In terms like the goose stepping, the organization, the innovation militarily, all that stuff existed before. Honestly, from my memory, it existed for at least about 100 or so years. It goes back to Otto von Bismarck in a little bit of a way. If you interested in Otto von Bismarck or more interested in World War One and ramifications of Otto von Bismarck, how that played into World War One, check out Dan Carlin's history, and it's called Blueprint for Armageddon, and it's a 6-part multi-hour series, but he goes into detail about World War One, the troop movements, the battles. He talks about the diaries of the soldiers, so all these numbers of deaths and casualties isn't just some video game like Call of Duty where he just detached from it. No, he actually talks about people's families, their last notes, their last letters to their daughters, last letters to their wives, them being terrified, being afraid, having the whole community, best friends die on the battlefield next to him. It's really sad. And I really appreciate people who do that. Excuse me. Because history and warfare isn't just about numbers or guns or bullets or explosions. It's people that doing that stuff. And those people that you're killing had dreams, hopes, and a family. I know it's something to be, mushy and thinking about, but at the same time, I don't like when people minimize these deaths or minimize these soldiers. There are people, and before they ended up on that battlefield, there was probably teachers or some other productive member of society. And I don't think we should forget that. But before I go into some whole rant about war and history and stuff, let's get into Thomas Sowell and see what he got to say about the Germans.
Germans are an old people. Their language is centuries older than English, French, Spanish, or Italian. But the history of a dozen years has cast a long shadow over the thousands of years of their existence as a people. The rule of Hitler and the Nazis from 1933 to 1945 not only sealed the fate of the Germans of that generation, it has colored the way Germans have been seen since then, as well as the way the previous history of Germans has been seen. German intellectual figures, social traditions, and political movements in centuries past that were once seen in the context of their own times are now often seen as precursors of Nazi totalitarianism or of the Holocaust. Was all of German history leading up to Hitler? Or were the Nazi years simply a tragic aberration on a monumental scale? The collectivization of Germans in the minds of others has had major consequences in the real world, quite aside from its impact on intellectual conceptions of this people. At the end of the Second World War, millions of people of German ancestry living outside the Reich in various parts of Eastern Europe and the Balkans were sent back to Germany, even though many of these families had been living where they were for centuries, and many of the individuals sent back to Germany had in fact never seen Germany. Winston Churchill protested these mass expulsions of millions of Germans on a scale grievous and undreamed of, and said, "We must banish revenge against an entire race from our minds." In order to assess the 12 fateful years of the Nazi regime and its relationship to German culture and history in general, we must first review that history and that culture. Germans, as a people, have extended well beyond the boundaries of present-day Germany, not only in Europe, but in overseas settlements in the Western Hemisphere and as far away as Australia. The extent to which these far-flung settlements could be considered German, and for how long, depends of course on the extent to which German culture persisted among them, and whether or not that culture was linked to the German nation-state. To assess that, we need to see, at least in outline, some of the prominent features of the culture and values historically associated with Germans. Moreover, the features of German culture stand out in sharper relief against the cultures of the surrounding peoples, such as the Slavs of Eastern Europe or the British and French to the west. Long before German societies became industrialized, Germans were skilled craftsmen in many fields. Germans were known for brewing beer in Roman times, and Germany today produces more beer than any other country in Europe. People of German ancestry have set up breweries as far away as Australia and China, the famous Tsingtao beer of China having been created by Germans there. The leading American brands of beer, Budweiser, Coors, and Miller, were likewise all created by people of German ancestry.
I wonder how their German ancestors feel about them now, doing all this, advertisement, just basically ignoring their customers and the people that support them for hundreds of years and go along this new woke stuff. I wonder how their ancestors feel about that and their stocks plummeting and the whole, value going down. Just sad.
German breweries in Buenos Aires drove English beer out of the market there. In the Brazilian state of Sao Paulo, the only producers of beer in the early 20th century were Germans. Beer-brewing Germans are not simply a stereotype. German craftsmen also pioneered in making pianos and took this skill with them to other countries. The first pianos in colonial America were built by Germans, who also led the way in building pianos in Australia, Russia, France, and England. German craftsmanship also created optical products that made such firms as Zeiss, Schneider, Rodenstock, and Voigtlander world leaders in high-quality lens production. The leading lens-making firm in the United States was founded by two German immigrants named Bausch and Lomb. Printing was another area in which Germans led the way. Gutenberg introduced printing with movable type in Europe, and centuries later, Germans set up the first printing press in the Western Hemisphere. When printing presses began to spread from Western Europe into Eastern Europe, they spread first into German enclaves in the East, because here were concentrated people who could read. Germans also pioneered in map making. The name America was given to the Western Hemisphere by a German mapmaker. Mining was another area in which Germans became renowned as far back as the 16th century. Copper mines in Britain were opened up by Germans, as were silver mines in Mexico, Spain, and Norway, in addition to the German mining communities in the Balkans already noted. German craftsmanship in metal created the first armor and swords manufactured in Mexico, as well as the renowned Kentucky rifle, which was in fact made by Germans in Pennsylvania.
I'm curious to see, because Thomas Sowell often talks about, which I agree with, the Roman Empire and how that civilization, that technology helped France and Britain and other people that used to be part of the empire, be more technologically advanced compared to other people, especially around the world. But Germany, for the most part, was never conquered by the Romans. So I'm curious to see what's like the, maybe origins or the push they had to help them get so good technologically. Maybe it could be because they're close relation to Europe and they just right next door to France. And we know France developed pretty semi-quickly after the fall of the Roman Empire. Sure, that kind of thing led to having a pope in France for a certain period of time. So I'm very curious to see about that whole, technological evolution of Germany. Maybe go into in this video.
For thousands of years, Germans excelled in military operations. German generals held positions of high command in the Roman legions, as they would in later centuries command armies in Tsarist Russia, in South America, and in the United States from the Revolutionary War of 1776 to the two world wars of the 20th century, in both of which the U.S. Army was commanded by generals of German ancestry, Pershing and Eisenhower, respectively. German commanders of American military forces in the Second World War also included Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded the Pacific Fleet, and General Karl Spaatz, whose bombers reduced much of Germany to rubble. In both world wars, the armies of Germany inflicted far more casualties on opposing forces than the Germans sustained themselves. During the Middle Ages, the Teutonic Knights conquered Prussia, which became the heartland of German military prowess for centuries to come. German fighting men were in demand by rulers in Eastern Europe and in the Ottoman Empire, and were used by the British in their attempt to suppress the rebellious American colonies, as well as by the Americans in order to bring their citizen army up to the military standards required to fight the British. Ironically, Germans produced not only leading military men, but also leading pacifist groups, such as the Mennonites, who also spread to other countries. Whether in agriculture, industry, commerce, or the military, Germans became known for thoroughness, organization, punctuality, and hard work, as well as for specific skills. Other countries not only welcomed German immigrants, but some actively recruited them, and in some cases subsidized their travel. Not only in Eastern Europe, but also in developing nations in the Western Hemisphere and in Australia, Germans were recruited to pioneer in opening up undeveloped wilderness. Wherever Germans settled around the world, there were newspapers printed in German. In Russia, the St. Petersburger Zeitung was founded in 1727, followed in later years by the Saratov Deutsche Zeitung in the German agricultural settlements on the Volga, and the Odesser Zeitung among Germans who settled by the Black Sea. In the United States during the immigrant era, most of the foreign language newspapers in the country were German. St. Louis had 2 daily newspapers in German as early as 1845, and out on the plains, there was an Odessa Zeitung set up by German immigrants from Russia who had kept their language and culture intact after settling in Russia for generations and then resettling in the United States. German language newspapers were published daily in 15 American cities, with such names as Die New Yorker Staatszeitung, the Cincinnati Volksblatt, the Chicago Abendpost, the Louisville Anzeiger, and the Deutsche Zeitung in New Orleans. In Brazil,
I just love how the German language sounds whenever I hear people speak it.
There was the Santa Cruz Anzeiger, the Deutsche Zeitung, and the Brazil Post. Elsewhere in South America, there were the Argentinisches Tagblatt and the Deutsche Zeitung für Paraguay, among others. In the Australian city of Adelaide, the Australische Zeitung was still being published in the late 20th century. These German-language newspapers in countries around the world were just one indication of the persistence of German culture among people settled for generations, or even centuries, in other countries. German settlers in Australia built houses and communities in the style that they had been used to in their homeland. A German traveler in 19th century Australia wrote of an immigrant settlement there. There are German public houses, a German drugstore, German doctors, stores, blacksmith, carpenter, school, church. In fact, everything is German. The traveler would believe himself in some little village of the old country between the Rhine and the Oder. A rural village in Argentina was described this way by a visitor in 1967. I entered the church and heard something I did not remotely expect in this distant place. Traditional German hymns of Holy Week, sung in typical Volga German style in which each voice remains distinct. I looked around. Men, women, and children were in their Sunday dress. Some of the women wore scarves. Beneath them were faces like those of the country people in Germany. In front of the nave, the minister was preaching in common German to the parishioners. It was difficult to believe that I was in Latin America, that the ancestors of these people had left Germany for Russia 200 years ago. This cultural persistence among Germans around the world represented a loyalty to the particular subculture of the locality from which they had come, not a political loyalty to the German nation. Many had, in fact, immigrated before there was a German nation created in 1871. A 19th century German community in Australia was described as the recreation of a Silesian village. In the United States as well, Germans from particular localities settled together and maintained the culture of that area. Frankfort, Kentucky, was founded by Germans from Frankfurt, Germany, and Grand Island, Nebraska, by Schleswig-Holsteiners. Lomira, Wisconsin, was settled almost exclusively by Prussians from Brandenburg, while the nearby towns of Hermann and Theresa were settled by Pomeranians. Even among Germans who immigrated from Russia to the United States, those who came from the Volga settlements established their own communities in the Plain States, distinct from the communities in those states established by those Germans who came from the Black Sea settlements. Even when they resettled again in California, the Volga Germans and the Black Sea Germans settled separately, the former around Lodi and the latter around Fresno. How long and to what extent the Germans remained culturally separate varied with circumstances. Rural enclaves tended to remain culturally insular longer and more completely than was the case when Germans settled in urban communities that included people of other nationalities and cultures. Where the Germans were the numerically predominant urban group, as they were for centuries in much of Eastern Europe, they could assimilate the local population, or at least its upwardly mobile elements, to the German culture. But where the Germans were greatly outnumbered, and especially where the great majority of the German immigrants were male, then interactions among groups, including intermarriage, eroded the German culture. This was the case in much of 19th century Australia, but not in South Australia, where whole families of Germans tended to settle together, and there were as many women as men, so that these communities could maintain their separate social and cultural identities for generations. It was much the same story in Brazil, where there was very little intermarriage with members of the local population living near German agricultural communities well into the 20th century, while in cities and in some rural areas where there were more diverse populations, acculturation and assimilation became more common.
Have you heard of the conspiracy theory that after World War II, the Nazis moved to South America and they resettled there? I'm curious to see what people think about that in the comments down below. Do you think that's true? Do you think that's just conspiracy theory to make people afraid of a Fourth Reich rising again? There's also that conspiracy about them being in Antarctica and that Operation High Jump that was actually commenced by the United States government, United States military to actually go to Antarctica. I don't know the exact details of the stuff from my understanding so far that stuff was classified, but I'm very curious to see if other people think that's true. When I was growing up, I used to watch a show called Brad Meltzer's Decoded, and one episode was about the Spear of Destiny. And honestly, I watch that episode at least once a year because that's still one of my favorite shows of all time. I just loved history back then just as much as I do now. And it was talking about the Spear of Destiny and how Adolf Hitler looked up to and thought it was some type of magical device to help him win the war. But then after they lost, they tried to like ship it away, and possibly they shipped it to Antarctica. But also they talked about Nazis being in South America, Brazil, and I think it's very possible considering the fact that we already know that there were German immigrants and German communities established in South America. So it's very plausible that these people knew that, considering they had knowledge of the world because of the world was at war at the time. So they had knowledge of these people in these communities. They could have easily just went there as like a place to settle down. I don't know about building a Fourth Reich, but at least going back to peace and trying to avoid the crimes and the consequences of the stuff they did. I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. It's an interesting conspiracy theory.
Yet even living in cities with large numbers of people from other backgrounds did not automatically lead to rapid assimilation. In New York City, where 90% of the population was non-German, in the early 20th century, most people of German ancestry nevertheless married other people of German ancestry. That changed over the years, but not immediately or rapidly. This cultural cohesiveness was seldom accompanied by political cohesiveness or group identity politics. Germans were usually not very politically active in any case, and they tended to be underrepresented among career politicians. Where German political leaders arose in other countries, it was seldom as representatives of ethnic Germans in those countries. In the United States, for example, those people of German ancestry who did achieve prominence in politics, the Muhlenbergs in the 18th century, Karl Schurz and John Peter Altgeld in the 19th, and Herbert Hoover and Dwight D. Eisenhower in the 20th century, did so as representatives of the American people at large, rather than as spokesmen for ethnic German interests.
That is very true. But it is interesting though because they did have a sizable, and of course still do, there's a sizable German population in the United States. So the president of the United States at the time, I think in World War I, Woodrow Wilson, and maybe in World War II at the same time, had to consider whether or not going to war was worth it because they had to worry about re-election. And if a good percentage of your voters are Germans or German Americans and you decide to go to war against their home country, they may not vote for you. So what he's saying is true about them not walking out or portraying themselves as paragons of the German community. But at the same time, Germans in America who were, German Americans, American citizens, they have political sway, at least on the president, especially during wartime. That's a very sensitive and dangerous time for any country, no matter how strong or weak you are. Sun Tzu talks about all time the art of war. If you overextend yourself or you let your populace get too angry and they revolt against you, you risk falling apart.
There were similar patterns in other countries. In Australia, Germans tended to be underrepresented in politics, and those Germans who achieved political office were elected from constituencies where there were few Germans, as well as from constituencies where Germans were the predominant population. In Russia, the presence of Baltic Germans in high positions in the Tsarist government was of no benefit to the Volga Germans or the Black Sea Germans, in whom these German officials took no interest and whom they looked down on as peasants. In Brazil, Germans long remained politically apathetic until after the Second World War, when they began to elect more deputies. However, in places where the German minority was under sustained political attack, such as by the Latvians or the Czechs, Germans were provoked into political activity. The persistence of German culture did not, in most cases, mean making public dramatizations of a separate identity, exceptions again being in places like Czechoslovakia. More commonly, Germans maintained their culture without making a public issue of it. In the United States, such American sports icons as Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig grew up speaking German, and so did Nobel Prize-winning economist George Stigler.
See a little bit more. Okay. So I really appreciate that German history stuff because I like to focus on the military aspects of it. And if I do know about the politics, it's really related to war. So that could be why a nation go to war, what led to them being defeated, the politicians or leaders at the time, especially when you go more into modern warfare. So understanding more about civilian side of it and the inventors and scientists and all the other important people that are German, that was very interesting to me. I know a lot about Eisenhower, just his importance in World War II, along with Nimitz and the other people they name, but I never correlated their last name with being German. I just thought of them as American generals or American people or American soldiers. So that is interesting to find out. I don't know, it is very, that's another thing to think about too, because you have the Japanese internment camps, and they was worried about those people being, I don't know, hidden actors or spies and stuff like that. But that really didn't occur to the German Americans. And you had German American generals, colonels, and people in positions of power, and that wasn't a concern. Maybe it's because the way that the Japanese fought and the way they started the war with the sneak attacks, so there's worry about more sneak attacks coming, but at the same time, it doesn't look good when you talk about freedom, democracy, and this, that, and the other, but then you put your citizens in jail for doing nothing besides the fear of the government. I think that just sets a bad precedent, and that was already set beforehand. World War One with Woodrow Wilson. I think he had this Espionage Act, which stopped people and newspapers from saying anything bad about the government or I think the president during times of war. And I think that's just another precedent or slide into tyranny, and that should have been stopped over 100 years ago at this point. It's 2023 and World War One started in 1914 and commenced all the way up until 1919. I don't know. I think the best solution when it comes to these governments or any type of government, because it's always going to involve people, is oversight. No matter what system you choose, I say this a lot, but no matter what system you choose, it could be capitalism, it could be communism, you could have a democracy, or you could have a totalitarian type of government. Regardless, oversight is needed because it's people. People are greedy, they can be corrupt, and it's going to be you suffering. It's not going to be them. Oftentimes, people start out saying they're good, they don't want to do this, that, and the other. They want to stop their oppressor, but then they become the oppressor too. That's why we don't listen or trust people that say, if we just change the system, overthrow the system, or if I was in charge, if they would be fixed. your ego just screams like, I don't know, you're gonna be power hungry. I'm not gonna risk my future or my family future for that type of stuff. But let me know what you think about this video. Germans, I feel like they get treated unfairly sometimes because of what happened in World War II. But if you're a German alive today, obviously it's not your fault. You wasn't born then. You can't change your past. You can only make the best of what you have now. I say that about black community and black America, and it's no different from German Americans or Germans that live in Germany today. I understand they have very strict laws about talking about the Nazi stuff and showcasing the Nazi stuff. That has a good and bad ramifications, but I don't know. That's not my government. I'm not German, so it's hard for me to really speak on the atmosphere or the feelings people have towards it. I just give my opinions and let y'all give your own. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. It's your boy Logos, and I'll see you next time. Peace.